Hello friends and welcome back to edupediaworld.com. In the last session we have discussed the basic concepts and measures of national income. In this session we'll discuss a problem of theoretical nature, that is the problem of national income determination. The two major questions with which we shall be concerned here are that what factors determine the level of national income and how is the equilibrium level of national income determined. Now, these two questions were first answered by J.M. Keynes in the year 1936. So, we are going to outline here the Keynesian theory of income determination. Now, according to Keynes, the entire economy is divided into four sectors, that is household sector, firms or the business sector, government sector and foreign sector. And relationship between all these four sectors will give us different models which Keynesian theory has given. So according to Keynes, there are three models to determine the national income, that is two-sector model, three-sector model and four-sector model. In this session, we'll be discussing about two-sector model. In the next session, we'll be continuing with three-sector and four-sector model. So let's start with two-sector model. Let's look at the assumptions of the two-sector model. The first assumption is that there are just two sectors, that is household and firms. Now, the household here own the factors of production and they sell the factor services to the firms, and for which they get the factor payments in the form of wages, interest, rent and profits. Whereas for the firms, on the other hand, they hire factor services from the households and produce goods and services which they sell to the households. So this was our first assumption. The second assumption is that there is no government, or even if the government is there, it is not interfering in the economic activities of the country. The third assumption is that the economy is a closed one, which means that there are no foreign trades happening. There is no economic transactions between countries happening. The fourth assumption is that there are no corporate savings. It means that whatever profits the firms are earning, they are distributing it to the shareholders as dividend. The fifth and last assumption is that the prices of all goods and services, the supply of labor and capital and the state of production technology, all of this remains constant. So these are the assumptions of the two-sector model. Let's proceed to the description of the model. So according to Keynes, national income of a country is determined by two factors, that is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And that point is a point of the level of national income where the aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate supply, that is the equilibrium point. So now, in order to know that how do we determine the equilibrium point, we are going to see that what is aggregate supply and what is aggregate demand. Aggregate supply, it refers to the total value of goods and services produced and supplied in an economy per unit of time. And the aggregate supply consists of two components, that is producer goods and consumer goods. That is, when we talk about aggregate supply, it means supply of producer goods and consumer goods. So how do we get the value of aggregate supply? The goods and services which are produced per unit of time is multiplied by their respective prices, which gives the total value of national output, and this is the value of aggregate supply in terms of money. So if we calculate the national output or aggregate supply, we can also say a national output in terms of money, which is equal to the aggregate supply. It is equal to the quantity multiplied by price per unit. So this is how we calculate the aggregate supply. Now let's see that what is the aggregate supply schedule. The Keynesian aggregate supply schedule or aggregate supply curve is drawn on the assumption that total income is always spent. That is, there are no savings and total income, or we can say aggregate income, is equal to the aggregate expenditure. Means whatever I am earning, I am spending on various goods and services. So this is the assumption made, and according to this assumption, the curve, that is the aggregate supply curve, which we get is a 45-degree line. I'll show you how. Let's draw a graph to show this. On x-axis, I take the aggregate income, which we denote by y, and on the y-axis, we take the aggregate expenditure, which we denote by AE. So, as I told you that aggregate income is equal to aggregate expenditure. Now listen to this very carefully. Aggregate income is equal to aggregate expenditure. Now this means that as and on my income increases, my expenditure will also increase. So income and expenditure are directly proportional to each other, which means that I will get a line, the aggregate supply line will be like this, which is constantly increasing. So this is the aggregate supply line, and this line is equal to 45-degree because my aggregate expenditure is always equal to the aggregate income. Fine. So we can also say that our AS is equal to the AE, that is aggregate supply is equal to aggregate expenditure. Now the second point to be noted here, this is the first point, that is my aggregate expenditure will always be equal to aggregate income, and the aggregate supply line which I am getting is a 45-degree line. The second point which I need to note here is that according to Keynes, aggregate income is always equal to consumption plus savings. We denote consumption by C and savings by S. So we can see that aggregate income is always equal to C plus S. Fine. So these are the two important points which we need to remember in deriving the aggregate supply. Now next we come to that what is aggregate demand. Now the aggregate demand is also known as effective demand, which means that the aggregate expenditure is made by the society per unit of time, usually 1 year. And it consists of two components, that is aggregate demand for consumer goods C and aggregate demand for capital goods I. So let's see that how aggregate demand is derived. As I told you that aggregate demand is equals to C plus I. Now C here stands for aggregate demand for consumer goods, that is consumption, and I is aggregate demand for capital goods, that is investment. Now according to Keynes, it is assumed that I is constant, that is it will not change. Now what about consumption? C depends upon the income of the consumer, which is denoted by Y. So Y here is the income of the consumer. So we can also say that C is a function of Y, that is, it will increase as and on the income of the consumer increases. Now to express this in a form of function, we write it like this, that is C is equals to A plus BY. Now you must be wondering that what is A? A here is a constant which will be equal to C when Y is 0. Got it? Let me explain this to you further. Suppose Y is equals to 0, fine. Then C will be equal to A plus B into 0, because Y, we have assumed Y is equal to 0. Then solving this further, A plus C is equals to A plus 0. Therefore, C will be equal to A. Because consumption can never be 0 even if your income is 0, which means that even if you are unemployed, still you will be consuming in order to live. Fine. So A is a constant that is equal to C when we assume that income is 0. Fine. Now, what about B? B is a constant that denotes a part of income which is spent on the consumer goods. I again repeat, B is a constant which denotes a percentage or a part of income which is spent on the consumer goods. For suppose my income is $100 and I am spending $10 out of this income on consumer goods. That is, my expenditure is $10. So B here will be equal to 10% of my income, fine, which is equals to 0.10. So B here will be equal to 0.10. Or rather we can say that B is equal to change in consumption upon change in income. Clear? Now let's move forward. This is how we derive the value of C and the value of I. I is supposed to be assumed to be constant. Now what about AD? That is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is equals to C plus I, okay? Or we can say, because C is equals to A plus BY, so we can say that aggregate demand is equals to A plus BY plus I. So aggregate demand is equals to A plus BY plus I. Now in order to illustrate it and in order to give you a clear view, let's do this with the help of example. Now suppose assume that C is equals to 50 plus 0.5 Y and I is equals to $50 billion. Now with the help of this data, you have to determine the aggregate demand, that is AD. Now as you know that AD is always equals to C plus I, so what we need to do now is we are going to assume the values of Y and we are going to put these values in this function, which will help us to derive the value of C, and to the value of C we are going to add the value of I in order to get the aggregate demand. So let's draw a schedule in order to show this. This is the aggregate demand schedule. So we take the income, then C, which is equals to 50 plus 0.5 Y. Then we take the investment, which is equals to $50 billion, and then we get the value of aggregate demand. So these are the 4 columns which we'll be showing. Now suppose the income value is 0. The income level is 0. So what will be the value of C? Revising upon, C will be equal to A. 50 is the value of A constant and 0.5 is the value of B constant. So when the income is 0, the consumption level will be equal to A. Let's show you that. So 50 plus 0 will be equal to 50. This is the consumption level. Now suppose when the income increases to 50, then what will be the value of C? 50 plus 50 into 0.5. See, we have assumed the value of Y to be 50. So in order to get the value of consumption, we'll multiply the value of Y to our constant B and we'll add the constant A to it and we'll get the consumption level. So 50 into 50 plus 50, it will be equal to 75. We get this value 25 by multiplying 50 into 0.5. Fine. Then suppose the value of income increases to 100. 50 plus 100 into 0.5, which will give us 50 equals to 100. Suppose it increases to 150, then 50 plus 150 into 0.5 equals to 75 equals to 125. Then 200, 50, we assume the value of income to be 200, 50 plus 200 into 0.5 equals 200, which will give us 150. Then 250, so 50 plus 250 into 0.5, this will give us 125. And this is equals to 175. Likewise, we keep on assuming the values of income and we get the value of consumption on the basis of that. Fine. Then as I told you that the investment level will always be constant. So for all level of income, the investment level will be constant, which is assumed to be $50 billion. Now, in order to get aggregate demand, C plus I is equals to aggregate demand. Aggregate demand will be equal to C plus I. That is, for the first case, it would be 50 plus 50 equals to 100, then 125, then 150, then 175, then 200, then 225, and then 250. Fine. So these are the values of aggregate demand for various levels of income. Now this is how we get the aggregate demand schedule. Now, as I told you initially, for the aggregate supply is always equal to the level of income, and so the first column here in this particular schedule shows us the aggregate supply. Now what you need to do is, in order to determine the equilibrium level, you have to see that in this particular schedule, what is the point where we are getting aggregate supply equals to aggregate demand. So you can see here at this particular level of income, that is 200, when we have assumed the income to be 200, our aggregate demand is also 200. So this is the particular level where we are getting the equilibrium point, where AD is equals to AS. So this is how we determine the national income through a schedule. Fine. Now this we can also show graphically. So let's draw a graph to show this. On X axis we take the income, which is dollar in billion, and on Y axis we take the expenditure, which is dollar in billion. So in order to get the equilibrium point, we need to know the AS curve and the AD curve. Revising upon AS curve will be a curve whose slope is always equal to 1. And why so? Because we have assumed that whatever is the income of the consumer, he is spending it all. That is, income is equal to the expenditure. And the expenditure will constantly increase according to the income of the consumer. If the income is increasing, the expenditure will increase, and both of them will be equal to each other. So we get a AS curve whose slope will always be equal to 1, and it will form a 45-degree angle. What about the AD curve? AD curve will be a summation of consumption and investment curve. And as Keynes has assumed that investment will always be constant, that is, it will be a line which is parallel to x-axis. In our example, we have taken the investment to be $50 billion. So it is constant at $50 billion, and it is a line which is parallel to x-axis. What about the consumption? The consumption will constantly increase according to the income of the consumer, and so we get a line like this. This is a consumption line. It starts at $50 billion. So summating these two, that is the consumption and investment line, we get our AD curve, which is like this. The AD curve will be equal to the consumption and investment curve. So you see here that the AD curve has cut the AS curve at this particular point. This is the point of equilibrium. At this particular point, the AD curve starts at $100 billion, $100 billion. At this particular point, the income is equal to the expenditure, which is equal to $200 billion. So E is a point where AD is equals to AS, and AD here is $200 billion, and AS is also here is $200 billion. So this is how equilibrium is determined, that is the level of national income is determined under Keynesian two-sector model. So the next important question which bugs us up is, why not equilibrium at any other point? Now in order to answer this question, let's get back to the graph. Now you can see here that the equilibrium point has been determined at $200 billion. Now suppose, what if the aggregate supply is more than aggregate demand? That is, AS is greater than AD, or rather we can say that C plus S, that is consumption plus saving, is greater than consumption plus investment. So what is happening here? That whatever the firms are producing, now listen to this very carefully, whatever the firms are producing, they are not able to sell the stocks to the consumers. So as a result, the firm will find that they have produced in excess of the aggregate demand, and their unsold stocks are piling up. So what they will do, they will reduce their production and cut down the expenditure on inputs. As a result of this, the demand for factors of production will also get decreased. This will actually reduce the income of the household, because Now the factor services are not being utilized by the firm, so from where they will get their income? This will reduce the income of the households and they will start spending less on the goods and services. Now this process will continue until again the equilibrium point of $200 billion is reached. Fine. Similarly, we can see that what will happen below the level of $200 billion, that is below the equilibrium point, that is where AD is greater than AS, that is aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. So at this particular level, that is this level, the firms are not able to meet up the demand of the market. That is, they are providing less output to the society. So when they realize that the demand of their product is more in the market, what they will do, they will start producing more, which will create more demand for the factor services, which will again enhance the income of the households therefore. And if the income of the households increase, they will demand more for goods and services in the market, which will again, and this process will therefore continue till again we reach the point of $200 billion. So you see here that if the economy is not at the equilibrium level, it will itself adjust and reach to the point of equilibrium. So we see that how do we determine the level, the national income, the level of income under Keynesian two-sector model. So this was about the theory of national income determination, that is, we have studied that how national income under two-sector model is derived under Keynesian theory. In the next session, we'll be continuing our discussion by discussing that how national income is derived under three-sector and four-sector model. Till then, have a nice time and thank you for watching Edupedia World videos.